The evening was full of memories that suddenly came flooding back to me. I thought I was over the past, but even years after my husband had left me and our son for another woman, the pain sometimes returned with renewed vigor. At first, there was unbearable resentment. The realization that for many years he had lived with us while secretly hiding another family. I was left with bitterness, pain, confusion, and worst of all, a sense of betrayal because I had truly believed that he was my man. Life forced me to become stronger. Steve was my support, my rock. Diligent, intelligent, caring, with a gentle humor and a huge heart. He was only 12 when it became just the two of us. And every day I saw him trying to protect me, as if he were the adult and I the child. My son matured early, and even though he's 22 now, I still worry that he's had to carry too much on his back. That night was no different from any other. I'd had another tiring day at work, and by evening, I could barely keep my eyes open. Steve was still doing chores and working on class projects while I made my way to bed, barely able to feel my legs. The moon shone softly through the thin curtains, its silvery light enveloping the room, making it feel calm and peaceful. As I lay down, I felt a rare, quiet happiness, grateful that we finally had stability. I remembered how Steve had smiled at dinner, how he had tried to cheer me up, and I fell asleep with a lightness that had seemed unattainable before. A knock on the door shattered the silence, waking me. Half asleep, I thought it was part of a dream, but the knock came again, louder this time. I opened my eyes and saw Steve standing in the doorway. He stood in the dim hallway light, looking at me with concern. "Steve, is something wrong?" I asked, trying to chase away the remnants of sleep and focus on his face. My voice was still hoarse, but I instantly sensed that something was bothering him. Steve was always reserved. He never wanted to alarm me and was used to dealing with difficulties in silence. He closed the door, walked over to the bed, and stood still for a moment before carefully sitting down beside it. His face was thoughtful, almost sad. I patted the spot beside me lightly, silently suggesting that he stay. "I can't sleep," he confessed quietly. I knew right away it wasn't just insomnia. He looked vulnerable, almost as he had when he was a child, when everything in his life was still simple and straightforward. I could see the tension in his eyes, the pain he still carried inside him. My boy, growing up too fast, battling inner demons that made it impossible for him to truly relax and trust. "Do you want to talk?" I asked softly, touching his hand. He shook his head, staring at the wall. But after a second, his fingers gripped my palm tightly. "Remember, I just want to be near you," he murmured, his voice barely audible, as if even those words were difficult to say. My heart clenched. In his words, I heard the deep sadness that had been in me all this time. I remembered how I had tried to replace his father, to be strong even when I still felt weak. I could only hold him then. And now, watching him grow up, watching someone who had already been through so much, I gently brushed his hair away from his forehead, smiled at him, and pulled him close. He shifted a little, settling beside me, and I felt his warmth. His fingers trembled slightly, as if we had been transported back to when he was little, seeking protection in my arms. We lay in silence, but it wasn't heavy. On the contrary, I felt an incredible sense of peace, as if for a moment, all fears and anxieties had dissolved in that embrace. I closed my eyes, and a wave of memories washed over me, from the beginning of our life to this very moment. We had been through so much, but Steve had stayed with me, despite the pain and betrayal, despite the wounds of the past that he carried in his own heart. "You're lonely too, aren't you, Mom?" he asked suddenly. His voice was quiet, almost timid, but his words were heavy. I didn't know what to say. So I stayed silent. The words I had hidden from myself for so long rose up inside me, no longer content to be buried behind smiles and reassurances that everything was okay. Yes, the loneliness had remained hidden from everyone, but I couldn't hide it from my son. "We have each other. Remember that," I whispered, my voice shaking slightly. Steve hugged me tighter, as if words didn't matter anymore. We were silent in that moment, but behind that silence was a whole story. A story about us. A story of how we had overcome everything together, day after day, year after year. We spent the night side by side, feeling each other's presence in the calm, as if we had finally found a safe harbor after the storm. Steve lay next to me, his breathing steady, but I could tell he was awake. There was that tense silence, the kind that always comes before speaking about something painful. And then, finally, he spoke. His voice so quiet, I barely caught the words. "Mom, do you miss him?" The question cut through the air. I knew he was talking about his father. It wasn't easy to talk about him. Everything he had done had left a deep scar in me. But I knew Steve needed the truth. "Steve, sometimes I missed him," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "But you know, he betrayed us. His life was always a secret hidden from me. And you know, he always wanted me to feel guilty for everything." Steve was silent, but I felt him tense, as if his thoughts were warring inside him. I knew my son wanted to know the truth. We had never discussed it so openly before. But tonight, something had changed. Something had shifted, as if finally there was no reason to keep quiet. "He blamed me for everything he could," I continued. "Once he even said he had to find another family because I didn't understand him. I was heartbroken, thinking I wasn't good enough. But then I found out the truth. When you were still a baby, he had been leading a double life for years. He had another family, and he even blamed me for it. Said I just misunderstood him." The bitterness of the memories overwhelmed me. I felt the tears rise, and suddenly, all the years of strength drained from me. I could no longer contain my emotions. Everything I had been holding in burst out. I began to cry. For the first time, I didn't try to hide my tears from my son. Steve squeezed my hand. His touch was firm, steady, a silent promise. "Steve, do you know what destroyed me the most?" I choked out, trying to hold back the full force of my tears. I believed him. I believed that our family was the most important thing to him, but he wasn't with us, not really. It was like he didn't even live with us at all. Steve remained silent, but his eyes burned with something I had never seen before. A mix of sympathy and anger. "Mom, you didn't have to take it," he finally said, his voice hoarse with emotion, with anger he was trying to suppress. "Why didn't you leave then?" The question struck me like a blow. I had asked myself the same thing for years. I wanted to protect Steve from the hardships of life. But now, I realized my son had grown up a long time ago. "Because I hoped," I said painfully. "I hoped I could keep the family together. For you. I thought I could make it better. Foolishly, I believed he would make things right for us. I thought in the end you would be happy, knowing you had a father." "Mom, you didn't have to put up with this for me," he said quietly. "All of it. The way you sacrificed yourself, the way you put up with his abuse. It wasn't your fault." Guilt overwhelmed me, but so did relief. It was suddenly clear. Steve had carried the pain and responsibility of our mistakes. He had blamed himself for what had happened between me and his father. "Steve, listen to me," I said, turning toward him. "It wasn't your fault. There was nothing you could have changed. It was his choice. His fault. And you know what? When I look at you, I'm happy that at least we still have us." My son's words, the longing he had been hiding, pierced straight to the depths of my heart, reviving a pain I thought I had buried long ago. He squeezed my hand tighter. And in that moment, I realized we both needed this conversation to finally let go of the past. Steve relaxed slightly. I saw his gaze soften, a quiet calm settling over him. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was warm, like a soft cloth covering our wounds. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen setting up breakfast while Steve sat across from me, tracing invisible patterns on the countertop. He stared off into the distance, hesitant. I could tell he wanted to say something but was struggling to start. "Mom," he said quietly, still not looking up. "Did you ever think that things could have been different?" The question hit me like a sudden gust of wind. I bit my lip, unsure how to answer. Had I thought about it? Of course. But looking at his focused, grown-up face now, I realized he wasn't just waiting for my answer. He was searching for something within himself. Maybe comfort. Maybe forgiveness. My thoughts raced, filled with memories I was afraid to bring to the surface. "Maybe," I said quietly, feeling as though I were reliving everything that had once shattered my life. Maybe I should have been more careful. Or maybe I should have left sooner when I first suspected something was wrong. Left earlier? He finally looked at me, his eyes full of intense anticipation. "And if you had left, I'd be fatherless, wouldn't I?" His words tightened something in my throat. I had spent so many nights wondering if it would have been better to walk away, to spare myself, to spare him from years of lies. But I had always been afraid of destroying his world, believing he deserved to have at least the image of a father. "Steve," I said, feeling a weight press against my chest. "I always wanted you to have a father, to have a family. But I stopped holding back my emotions. I was wrong. When I found out about the other woman, about his other family, I tried to convince myself that I could handle it, that I could forgive, for your sake. But every time he left, every time he wasn't there for us, it was like I lost a part of myself." Steve looked away, his fingers clenching into a fist. In that moment, I wanted to go to him, to hug him, to tell him it wasn't his fault. But I knew he didn't need comfort. He needed the truth. I always thought that if I had been better, if I had pleased him more, he wouldn't have left. He said, his voice barely above a whisper. I guess I just wasn't what he wanted his son to be. His words burned me from the inside out. I walked over, sat beside him, and wrapped my arms around him as if I could shield him from the monstrous thoughts he carried inside. "No, Steve," I said, my voice breaking as tears welled up. "His leaving wasn't because of you. His decisions, his mistakes, those were his, not yours. I want you to know that. You gave me the strength to live. You gave my life meaning. And I have never, for a single second, regretted that it's just us." He pulled me tight against him, and I felt his shoulders shake. I stroked his back, and the silence that had hidden everything we had been afraid to say, finally broke. "You've been alone for so long," he whispered, squeezing my hand. "And it's all because of him, because of his lies." Every word was like reopening an old wound. I wanted to tell him I hadn't been hurt in a long time, but that would be a lie. The relationship with his father had left scars that would never fade. But those scars had made me who I was. We sat there, holding each other. And slowly, as if we were exposing the deepest parts of ourselves, we felt the weight of the past begin to lift. We cried, but they were tears of release, of letting go of the resentment and doubt that had eaten away at us for years. The morning light filtered softly through the kitchen window. Steve pulled me a little closer, as if grounding himself in our embrace. His gaze was calm now, almost childlike, but so sincere. The look of a boy who finally knew there were no more walls between us. I smiled at him through my tears, and it was the purest relief I had ever felt. We couldn't change the past, but maybe now we had a chance to move forward, together. Every moment of that night settled into my memory like frozen frames, each one filled with something intangible yet profound. Between us, there was something new, something more than there had ever been before. Steve looked especially vulnerable. This wasn't just a conversation between a mother and her son. It was a journey back in time. A night of reliving everything that had been left unspoken. A night of unburdening the weight we had carried for too long. And as I looked at him, I knew we were finally free.